They manipulated me into paying for an all-expenses Portugal trip with "we'll pay you back" bullshit. When I asked for thousands back, "You make more money." So I left them in a foreign country with no money and aired every receipt on social media. We were standing on a rooftop bar in Lisbon, 4 days into a trip I'd paid for almost entirely by myself, when my best friend of 12 years looked me in the face, drink in hand, sunset behind her, and said, "You make more money than all of us. It's not like it's a big deal for you," she said it casually. Like she was commenting on the weather. Like the $7,000 I'd put on my credit card for flights, accommodations, dinners, excursions, and incidentals for 4 people over the past 2 weeks of planning was the financial equivalent of buying a round of coffees. And something in me, something that had been bending for years, for longer than this trip, for longer than this friendship, finally snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It snapped the way a wire snaps under tension. 1 second it's holding, the next second it's not, and everything it was supporting crashes to the ground. I looked at her. I looked at the other two. I took a sip of my drink. I set it down. I said, "You're right. It's not a big deal." And I walked off that rooftop, back to the Airbnb I'd booked and paid for, and I started packing my bag. By midnight, I had a one-way ticket home. By morning, I was at the airport. By the time they woke up, I was gone. And so was the credit card that had been funding their vacation. Let me back up. Because this didn't start on a rooftop in Lisbon. It started years ago, in the slow, invisible way that financial exploitation always starts between friends, with small asks, small generosities, and the unspoken assumption that the person who earns the most should always pay the most. My name is Nia. I'm 31. I work in tech. Specifically, I'm a senior data engineer at a company that pays me well. Very well. I grew up without money. Free lunch program. Hand-me-down clothes. Shared a bedroom with 2 siblings in an apartment that smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. I clawed my way into a scholarship, through a computer science degree, through 3 underpaying entry-level jobs, and into a position where, for the first time in my life, I could breathe. I could pay my rent without doing math first. I could go to the grocery store and not check my account balance in the parking lot. I could save. I could invest. I could say yes to things. And that yes is where everything went wrong. Because the people around me saw the yes and mistook it for always. The group was 4 of us. Me, Tasha, Rena, and Jade. We'd been friends since college. Freshman year orientation. Bonded over bad dining hall food and worse romantic decisions. We were the kind of friend group that felt permanent. Matching Halloween costumes. Group chat that pinged 100 times a day. Birthdays that were events. We'd been through breakups, job losses, family drama, and 2 cross-country moves. I loved them. Genuinely. Not performatively. Not transactionally. I love them the way you love people who saw you before you became anything, who knew the version of you that ate ramen because it was all you could afford and who never made you feel less for it. The problem is, as I grew financially, they didn't. And instead of that being a neutral fact, it became the defining dynamic of every interaction we had. Tasha was a barista. She'd been a barista for 8 years. She talked about going back to school but never enrolled. Rena worked in retail management. She made enough to live but not enough to save. Jade was a freelance photographer who had good months and bad months, and the bad months outnumbered the good by about 3 to 1. I don't say this to judge them. I say it because their financial realities are the backdrop against which every dollar I spent on this group needs to be understood. They weren't struggling because they were lazy. Life is complicated. Paths diverge. But the fact remains, I was the only one in the group with disposable income. And over the years, that income became communal property in their minds. Not officially. Never explicitly. Just in the way it played out. Every single time. The pattern started small. Dinners where I'd pick up the check because someone forgot their card. Ubers that I'd pay for because I'll get you next time. Birthday gifts where they'd go in on something together for me and I'd buy each of them something individually because I wanted to. Concert tickets where I'd front the cost and the Venmo requests would go unanswered for weeks, then months, then quietly forgotten. None of it was dramatic. None of it was a confrontation. It was erosion. Slow, steady, invisible erosion of boundaries I never set because I didn't want to be the rich friend who made everything about money. I grew up poor. I knew what it felt like to be the one who couldn't afford to go. I never wanted to be the reason someone felt that way. So I paid. And paid. And paid. And smiled while doing it because the alternative, saying no or "where's my money," felt like it would break something I valued more than the cash. The Portugal trip was Tasha's idea. She brought it up in the group chat about 4 months before the trip. Girls' trip to Portugal. Who's in? Everyone was in. Immediately. Exclamation points and heart emojis and let's go. And then the silence. The specific silence that always followed the excitement in our group. The silence where nobody said, "So how are we splitting costs?" Because they didn't need to say it. They knew who was going to handle it. They'd trained me to handle it. And I trained myself to volunteer. I booked the flights. 4 round-trip tickets from the US to Lisbon. Total, $3,400. I booked the Airbnb. A 2-bedroom apartment in Alfama with a terrace and a view. 7 nights. Total, $1,800. I set up a shared Google Doc for expenses and sent it to the group with a breakdown: flights, accommodation, estimated food, estimated activities. Per person share, roughly $1,800. I said, in the chat, clearly and directly, "I'll front everything and you guys can Venmo me your share before we leave." 3 thumbs up emojis. No Venmo. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not in 4 months. I brought it up twice before the trip. The first time, Tasha said, "Girl, I'm so tight right now, but I'll have it before we go." "Promise," Rena said. "Same, I just had a car repair thing." Jade said, "My last client hasn't paid me yet, but it's coming." 3 promises. 3 excuses. 3 people who had 4 months to save $1,800 and didn't put aside a dollar. I brought it up the second time 2 weeks before the departure date. The energy shifted. Tasha said, "Can we just settle up after the trip?" "It's stressing me out." Rena said, "Yeah, let's just have fun and deal with money after." Jade hearted the message. And I, because I am a people-pleasing coward who spent 30 years avoiding conflict, said, "Sure, that works." That was my fault. I own that. I should have drawn the line there. I should have said, "No, I need the money before we go or I'm canceling." But I didn't. Because I was afraid of being the one who ruined the trip. Afraid of being the one who made it about money. Afraid of hearing the thing I would eventually hear on that rooftop in Lisbon: "You make more money." I was so afraid of that sentence that I spent $7,000 trying to avoid it. And I heard it anyway. The trip itself was beautiful and enraging in equal measure. Lisbon is stunning. The tiles, the light, the food, the sound of fado music drifting out of restaurants at night. I would have loved every second of it if I wasn't mentally calculating costs every time someone ordered another drink or suggested another excursion. Day 1, dinner at a seafood restaurant. Bill came. Everyone looked at me. I paid $220. Day 2, guided tour of Sintra. I'd booked and prepaid. $340 for 4. Day 3, wine tasting. Tasha's suggestion. $180 for the group. Tasha put down her glass at one point and said, "This is the life," and I thought, yes, it is, and I'm the one writing the check for it. By day 4, I'd spent an additional $1,200 on food, activities, and transportation beyond what I'd already fronted. The Google Doc sat untouched. Nobody had logged a single expense or sent a single payment. I was keeping track on my own, on my phone, in a notes app, with timestamps and photos of receipts that I took every time I paid for something. Not because I was planning what came next. Because I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind and I needed proof that I wasn't imagining it. Proof that 3 grown women were watching me pay for everything and saying nothing. Proof that the pattern was real and not something I'd constructed in my head out of insecurity about my own success. The rooftop bar was on the evening of day 4. We'd spent the afternoon at a market where Jade bought a ceramic vase and Rena bought 3 scarves and Tasha bought a leather bag. They bought themselves souvenirs. With their own money. Money they had. Money they could have been using to chip in. But chipping in was for other people. Chipping in was for friends who made the same amount. I made more. So the rules were different for me. I brought it up gently. I said, "Hey, so just a heads up, I've been tracking everything and we're up to about $7,000 total for the trip. I'd love to square up soon so I'm not carrying it all." I said it with a smile. I said it casually. I was still being the accommodating friend, still softening every edge, still wrapping a reasonable request in enough cushion that it wouldn't bruise anyone's ego. Tasha looked at me. And she said, "I mean, you make more money than all of us. It's not like it's a big deal for you." Rena nodded. Jade looked at her phone. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said, "That's not fair." Nobody said, "We owe her." They just sat there, on a rooftop that my credit card had put them on, in a country that my planning had brought them to, and agreed, silently and collectively, that my money was their money and always had been. It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. One they'd apparently reached a long time ago and had just never said out loud. I took a sip of my drink. I set it down. I said, "You're right. It's not a big deal." I stood up. I walked out. I walked back to the Airbnb. I sat on the bed in the room I'd been sleeping in, and I opened my laptop. I searched for flights home. There was a seat on a 6 a.m. flight through Madrid. I booked it. One ticket. $680. The last thing I'd spend on this trip. For myself. I packed my bag. I didn't leave a note. I didn't text the group chat. I didn't have a dramatic exit conversation. I checked out of the Airbnb app, which meant that when the booking ended in 3 days, they'd have to either rebook it themselves or leave. The credit card on file was mine. The reservation was in my name. And I was about to be on a different continent. I left the apartment at 4:30 a.m. The streets of Lisbon were empty and blue. I got in a cab. I went to the airport. I boarded the plane. I turned off my phone. And somewhere over the Atlantic, at 35,000 feet, I opened the Notes app on my phone and looked at every receipt, every screenshot, every unanswered Venmo request, every group chat message where they'd promised to pay me back and didn't. I looked at all of it. And I started organizing it into folders. Because when I landed, I was going to do something I'd never done in 12 years of friendship. I was going to tell the truth. Publicly. With receipts. I landed at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 hours after I left Lisbon. My phone had been off for the entire flight. When I powered it on in the airport terminal, it took a full 2 minutes to load the notifications. 47 text messages. 16 missed calls. 9 voicemails. The group chat had exploded. The messages started confused and ended furious. Here's the progression, paraphrased but accurate. 5:30 a.m. Lisbon time, where's Nia? 6 a.m., her room is empty. Her stuff is gone. 6:15 a.m., she left? Like left? 6:22 a.m., the Airbnb says checkout is in 3 days but her card isn't on it anymore. What are we supposed to do? 7 a.m., Nia, answer your phone. 7:15 a.m., this is so messed up. 7:30 a.m., she literally left us in another country. 8 a.m., from Tasha, I can't believe she's doing this over money. Over money. I stared at that message in the airport terminal and I laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that happens when something is so absurd and so perfectly illustrative of the problem that your body doesn't know what else to do. Over money. $7,000. 4 months of ignored Venmo requests. 12 years of picking up checks and fronting costs and being the group ATM. And when I finally stopped dispensing cash, I was the one doing this over money. Not them. Not the 3 women who watched me pay for an international vacation and responded with "you make more." Me. Because in their framework, my money was communal, and withdrawing it was an act of aggression. I didn't respond to any of the messages. Not one. I drove home. I took a shower. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I opened every folder I'd organized on the plane. And I built a post. I'm not proud of this part. I want to be honest about that. What I did next was effective, and it was satisfying in the moment, and I don't regret the result, but I'm not going to pretend it was graceful or noble or the high road. It wasn't the high road. It was the road where you've been walked on for so long that when you finally stand up, you don't just stand. You stomp. I posted on Instagram. Not a vague story. Not a subtweet. A full carousel post. 10 slides. Slide 1. I just came home early from a trip I paid for because my friends told me my money isn't a big deal since I make more than them. Here's the receipts. Literally. Slide 2. Screenshot of the original Google Doc showing the per person breakdown. Slide 3. Screenshot of the group chat where they agreed to pay before the trip. Slide 4. Screenshot of me bringing it up and getting told let's just deal with it after. Slide 5 through 8. Photos of every receipt. Every dinner. Every excursion. Every Uber. Every single transaction, timestamped, totaled, and annotated with who benefited. Slide 9. The Venmo request history showing months of unanswered payment requests. Slide 10. The Rooftop text exchange where Tasha said you make more money and nobody pushed back. I captioned it, 12 years of friendship. $7,000 in costs. $0 repaid. When I asked to be reimbursed, they said it doesn't matter because I earn more. So I came home. This is what being the successful friend looks like. You're not a friend. You're a funding source. And I'm done. I posted it at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. By midnight, it had been shared over 400 times. By morning, it was on Twitter. By the next afternoon, 2 financial influencer accounts had reposted slides from it with commentary about friend group financial abuse. I didn't expect that. I expected maybe 50 likes and a few "you go girl" comments from acquaintances. Instead, it went semi-viral because the story hit a nerve. Thousands of people had lived some version of it. The successful friend who always pays. The group that never reciprocates. The guilt of having money in a circle where others don't. The slow, invisible exploitation that hides behind "will get you next time and don't worry about it and you can afford it." My post became a mirror that a lot of people recognized themselves in. And the reflection was ugly. Now let me tell you what happened to Tasha, Rina, and Jade in Lisbon. Because while my post was going viral, they were still in Portugal. With no Airbnb. With limited funds. With return flights that were 3 days away and no credit card willing to absorb the gap. They scrambled. From what I pieced together through mutual friends and through the public comments Tasha later made trying to defend herself, they spent the first night in a hostel that Rina found last minute. Shared room. Bunk beds. Not the terrace apartment in Alfama. They ate cheap for the remaining days. They couldn't afford any more excursions. They sat in parks and free museums and tried to salvage what was supposed to be a luxury trip that they contributed nothing to financially. Tasha called her mother for an emergency transfer. Rina maxed out a credit card she'd been trying to pay down. Jade borrowed money from her ex-boyfriend, which apparently went about as well as you'd expect. They survived. They made their flights home. Nobody was in danger. Nobody was stranded without options. They were just, for the first time in 12 years, forced to spend their own money on themselves. And they were furious about it. Tasha posted a response. Of course she did. She wrote a long Instagram story calling me toxic and performative and saying I'd publicly humiliated them to get clout. She said I had volunteered to pay for everything and was now weaponizing generosity. She said I'd abandoned them in a foreign country with no warning. She tagged me. She tagged mutual friends. She tried to rally a counter-narrative. It didn't work. Because receipts are receipts. Screenshots don't lie. The Venmo requests were time-stamped. The group chat messages were unedited. Every claim I made was documented, and every defense Tasha offered was emotion without evidence. Her post got sympathy from her immediate circle. But anyone outside that circle who saw both posts came to the same conclusion. 3 women mooched off their friend for years, got confronted, responded with entitlement, and then were shocked when the friend stopped paying. Rina and Jade went quiet. They didn't post. They didn't respond. They unfollowed me within 48 hours and that was it. No apology. No acknowledgement. No Venmo payment. Just silence. The same silence they'd given my payment requests for years, now applied to the entire friendship. I was, apparently, easier to discard than to repay. The mutual friend fallout was swift and illuminating. Our wider social circle split. Not evenly. About 70% of the people who knew all 4 of us sided with me once they saw the receipts. The other 30% either stayed neutral or quietly sided with the group, mostly because they were closer to Tasha personally and didn't want the conflict. A few people reached out to me privately to say things like, I always wondered how you guys split things and I noticed they never paid when we all went out. Apparently, the pattern was visible to everyone except me. Or maybe it was visible to me too, and I just didn't want to see it, because seeing it would have meant admitting that the friendships I valued most were, at their core, transactional. And I was the only one doing the transacting. One mutual friend, a woman named Priya who had been on the periphery of the group for years, sent me a message that I've reread a dozen times. She said, Nia, I've watched this happen for years. At every dinner, every trip, every birthday. They let you pay because you let them. And they convinced themselves it was normal because you never said no. That doesn't make it your fault. But it does mean the pattern won't stop until you stop it. And you just stopped it in the most public way possible. Good for you. That message made me cry. Not because it was kind, though it was. Because it confirmed what I'd been afraid to admit, everyone could see it. Everyone except me. My mother saw the post. She called me the morning after. My mother is a woman who cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years to keep a roof over 4 kids' heads. She knows the value of $1 in a way that most people never will. She said, Nia, how long has this been going on? I said, years, Mom. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't raise you to be anyone's bank account. I raised you to be generous, yes. But generous to people who respect you. Not to people who expect you. She said, you worked too hard for this. You came from nothing. You built everything yourself. And these girls watched you build it and decided it belonged to them. My mother doesn't get emotional often. She survived too much for that. But her voice cracked when she said, I'm proud of you for walking away. But I'm angry it took this long. She was right to be angry. So was I not at them? At myself. For 12 years of silence. For 12 years of choosing comfort over confrontation. For 12 years of letting the fear of being called cheap or difficult or the rich friend who makes everything about money override the basic, obvious truth that I was being used. Let me talk about the money, because people always ask, did they ever pay you back? No. Not a dollar. Not a cent. $7,000, gone. Added to the years of dinners and rides and tickets and gifts that I'll never see a return on. I thought about small claims court. Bill Hackworth, the lawyer from Another Story, I'm joking again. I consulted a real attorney. She said I could pursue it, but the cost of filing, the time involved, and the difficulty of proving verbal repayment agreements would likely make it a net loss. She said, sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one that teaches you who your friends really are. I didn't file. I ate the $7,000. I considered it the cost of ending a 12-year pattern that would have cost me far more if I'd let it continue. I want to talk about what this did to me internally, because people see the receipts post and they think I walked away feeling like a boss. I didn't. I walked away feeling empty. 12 years of friendship. Freshman year orientation. Matching Halloween costumes. Group chats that felt like home. Gone. Not because of a fight. Because of money. Because 3 women I loved decided my success was their subsidy, and I decided I was done subsidizing. The emptiness wasn't about the cash. It was about the realization that I'd been paying for proximity. That the warmth I felt in those friendships had a price tag, and the moment I stopped paying, the warmth disappeared. That's not friendship. That's a subscription. And I canceled mine. I spent the next few months rebuilding. Not my finances. Those recovered. My sense of self. My ability to say no without guilt. My ability to let a check sit in the middle of a table without reaching for it reflexively. My therapist called it financial boundary work. I called it learning to stop being a doormat in expensive restaurants. We spent entire sessions unpacking why I'd let this happen. The answer wasn't complicated. It was painful. I grew up with nothing. I grew up watching my mother count quarters for the laundromat. I grew up as the kid who couldn't go on the field trip because the $20 fee was $20 we didn't have. And when I finally made money, real money, the kind of money that meant I'd never have to count quarters again, I became terrified of being the person who says no. Because saying no felt like becoming the poverty I'd escaped. Saying no felt like admitting that money mattered to me, and admitting money mattered felt like admitting I was still that kid in the free lunch line. So I said yes. To everything. To everyone. And the people closest to me learned that my yes had no bottom. That it would keep giving and giving and giving until there was nothing left. And they were right. It would have. If Lisbon hadn't happened. I started paying attention to dynamics and new relationships. Who offers to split the bill? Who remembers the Venmo request? Who says let me get this one and means it? These became my screening criteria. Not because I'm stingy. Because I learned that how people treat your money is how they treat you. And the people who treat your generosity as an entitlement will never see you as anything more than what you provide. I'm 31. I live alone. I have a good job. I have new friends, fewer of them, but the kind who split the check without being asked and who would rather stay home than let me pay for everything. I have boundaries I didn't have 2 years ago. I have a savings account that no longer hemorrhages into other people's lifestyles. I have a life that is smaller and quieter and more honest than the one I had in that friend group, and I would not trade it back for anything. Tasha texted me once, about 6 months after Portugal. She said, I miss you. Can we talk? I didn't respond. Not because I was being petty. Because there was nothing to talk about. She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say I owe you money. She didn't say I was wrong, she said I miss you. And I know what she misses. She misses the version of me that said yes. The version that covered checks and booked flights and fronted costs and swallowed resentment with a smile. She misses the wallet, not the woman. And the woman has finally learned the difference. Rena got married last year. I found out through Priya. I wasn't invited. I wouldn't have gone. Jade posted a series of stories from the wedding. Matching dresses. Group photos. The 3 of them together, arms linked, smiling. No empty space where I used to stand. They closed the gap. Filled the absence. Moved on. Like I was never there. Like 12 years was a placeholder for the next person who would pay for the privilege of being included. People ask me if I went too far with the public post. If I should have handled it privately. If airing receipts on social media was petty. And here's what I say to that. I asked privately for 4 months. I asked nicely. I asked directly. I asked in person, in the group chat, and one-on-one. I was ignored every single time. Private didn't work. Private was where they thrived. Private was where "we'll pay you back" lived forever without accountability. Private was where 3 women could spend my money and never face a single consequence. Public was the only place where the truth had witnesses. And the truth deserved witnesses. Because I spent 12 years being generous in private and exploited in silence. The least I deserved was to be honest out loud. I don't miss them. I thought I would. I thought the absence of those friendships would leave a hole that nothing could fill. It didn't. The hole was already there. It had been there for years. I just couldn't see it because I kept filling it with money. The rooftop in Lisbon. The sunset. The drink in my hand. The words "you make more money" floating through the air like they were nothing. That's the image I carry. Not with bitterness. With clarity. Because that sentence, delivered with such casual certainty by a woman who had known me for 12 years, told me everything I needed to know about what I was to them. Not a friend. Not a sister. Not a person. A resource. And resources don't have feelings. Resources don't get hurt. Resources don't need to be paid back. I'm not a resource anymore. I'm just Nia. And Nia's card is declined. Permanently. For anyone who thinks her love comes with a credit limit.